Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to another week of Garden Hour, and hopefully we're going to give you a lot of good information on what's going on. Springs are always busy. You know, it seems like it's popping up everywhere in the state, along with some very welcome rains in a few areas, and unfortunately, a very unwelcome tornado, which did cause a lot of damage down in the Southern Hills area as one location. But of course, all our plants are beginning to bloom and we're getting things to grow. And of course, the insects and diseases are beginning to appear as well. So tonight we're going to try to cover a little bit of everything that's going on. And to begin with, my name is John Ball. I'm the Extension Forestry Specialist for South Dakota Extension, and I'm also the Forest Health Specialist for the South Dakota Department of Agriculture and Natural Resources. And I travel the state every week. In fact, tonight I'm doing this via the extension office in Rapid, just coming out of the field. So I apologize for my clothes. But good day out there working on a lot of pests that I'll be talking about a little bit later. But tonight I'm joined by a number of other individuals here. So Kristine, introduce yourself, please.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Kristine Lang, the new Consumer Horticulture Extension Specialist based here in Brookings, but also starting to work my way across the state. I'm making my way up to Aberdeen and then Watertown later this week and really looking forward to it. Tonight, I look forward to sharing just a few updates on annual flowers and some perennials that are blooming. I know that we have lots to choose from, and again, very grateful that it rained last night. We got free tents in Brookings, and tell you what, it was better than nothing.
And then we also have Rhoda Burrows with us tonight. So Rhoda?
Good evening. We also were rejoicing that the rain we got here, although not quite so much the stuff that came down in hard little pellets, but so we did have a little bit of hail damage around town, but not too bad because they were all pea-sized. But anyway, I'll be talking tonight about some of the amendments that you can put in your soil, either in your garden or especially in raised beds or containers, and how to choose which to put for your situation.
Well, that's great. And I'm sure that'll be really helpful as well. And you know what? You're right. You did get some hail. When I was driving down in Custer, there was a couple of hail pockets. And then Sunday night, as I was driving across the state, unfortunately, there were a number of semis that were tipped over, as well as a few RVs. Unfortunately, in South Dakota, we do have wind. But we also have a lot of pest problems. And one of the things that I really enjoy about my job is the fact that nowadays, everybody's got a camera. It's their phone. We've all got these. And so I'm going to cover just a couple of things that came in this week and then talk to you a little bit about some other stuff and answer some questions. But this time of year, one of the things I get is someone will look at their linden tree and they'll notice this white fuzz on the underside. And believe it or not, those are mites. And they say, well, you know what? I think they're killing my tree. No. They're making it look a little on the ugly side if you look at the underside of the leaves, but they're usually not tree killers. Now, here's an interesting one that I get to follow up on. I had someone send me this, but then they also sent me a picture of their window. And the window underneath the tree was covered in slime. And so the problem they're actually having is scales. I'm almost positive when I look at it. And scales that produce honeydew, that sticky material that they excrete. And that was kind of running down their window. And I've seen it where underneath a big elm tree or a big linden tree, everything is tacky underneath it. And it's because they have scales, and scales are sessile. They don't move as adults. The young, what we call crawlers, do move, but they're so small you cannot see them without a microscope. But some of them, the soft scales, produce honeydew. It's a sticky material. Aphids will do it as well. And that will rain down on anything below it. And I have seen some scale infestations that are heavy enough that that's causing problems. But, as Amanda, one of our entomologists, says, too often we blame whatever we see for the problem as opposed to whatever the real problem is. And in this case, mites are far often blamed for things they're not causing. Now, the next picture is even better, because I want to show you one problem that, now this is what I'm getting right now. People are contacting me and say, there's something wrong with my spruce tree. It's producing all these galls at the tips. These are not galls. These are the male cones that spruce produce. And you can see that even if you look close, they kind of look like a little cone. Now, by the way, the male cones fall apart very quickly. You're not going to see them persist. They last for another week or 2 or 3 at the very most, and then they fail away. Their whole job is to release pollen. And then after that, they're done. The woody cones are the female cones, and those are the ones that produce the seed to it, the little wing seed. To prevent yourself from pollinating yourself, which is not something spruce want to do, the female cones, all right, the woody cones are at the top of the tree, and the male cones are at the bottom of the tree. And the idea being is the pollen picked up by the males is going to be swept up and carried up into the air. But by that point, it's going to be another spruce tree that it's pollinating. But I get these calls every year, and people say, my gosh, there's something wrong with my spruce. What do I do? And then nothing. And then the other thing, if you shake them, you'll get this dust off it. And they'll say, well, I'm sneezing. That's the problem. No, these are very big pollen grains. They literally are going to get stuck in your nose. They're not the fine powder that we get with a number of other plants that cause it. And by the way, since I'm on this, I might mention a number of you are out there right now blaming lilacs for your allergies. And I'm allergic to lilacs. You're not. Lilacs are insect pollinated. They have really sticky pollen, and that pollen is not going to make you sneeze at all. Again, it's the same thing. I see something, therefore that must be the problem. But an interesting point is some people aren't allergic. It's not an allergy, but it's an irritant to the scent of lilacs. And so there's some people out there that do react. It's not a true allergy, but just the scent of a lilac is what can cause them problems. And that's usually if you brought a bouquet in the house and put it in there, but it's not a true allergy. So these are kind of some of the problems we're seeing. But before we lose that spruce picture, one of the things that we do have with spruce right now, despite the welcomed rains, spruce are shallow rooted trees. They demand water, not that they like water, they demand water. And if you live anywhere in South Dakota, well, including the Black Hills, which is not getting rain and where spruce are native, but the rest of the state, spruce are not native. And they do not really like our climate that much. And I can't overemphasize, if you got young spruce out there, last year you should have been watering them every week. This year, you should be watering them every week. In the ideal world, you'd be watering them every week. Set the hose down, let it trickle in. And I realize that's not always practical. But when I get the calls this year and later this year, certainly, people saying my spruce is dying, what do I spray? H2O. Because you really need to get the water down on the spruce in order for them to really do well. Well, we'll go to some questions here. And I've got a question here. I have some 2-year-old dwarf apple trees in full bloom. Are they ready to bear fruit at this age? Should I remove the blossoms and let them grow more structure? I'm going to start answering that, and then I'll let Rhoda come in. We'll get a second opinion from 2 doctors. What the heck? But, you know, if it's a dwarf fruit tree, apple tree, they do come into bearing sooner when you plant them as opposed to a full-size standard tree. If you just went out and bought a standard apple, some of those will not be bearing for 10 years from planting, many at 5 years. But some of the dwarfing rootstocks, they'll start bearing in year 2. And so this may not be an unusual feature at all. They're kind of ready. They mature really quick, very short childhood. Now, his question was, should I remove the blossoms and let them grow more structure? My opinion is no. if you're caring for those trees and if you're providing them with proper water, you've got them mulched, you're managing their fertility, and they don't need a lot of fertilizer. So I'm not saying you're going to go out and fertilize them, but the fact that they're going to flower this spring is not a real issue. Now, when they start bearing fruit, you might thin out some of the fruit so you don't have too heavy of a crop. But I'm an impatient sort of guy. So if I can get fruit in 2 years, it really should not be that much stress on the tree. However, Rhoda, what's your opinion on there? Would you go out there and remove the blossoms? One, I wouldn't have that much time, but I would perhaps thin the fruit if they did bear a lot. But what do you think?
One of the things I'd look at is how much growth they put on last year. And, if you've got a foot of new growth, you're probably good. If you got 2 inches or 3 inches of new growth, the tree is struggling. So I'd kind of base it partly on that. I usually tell our master gardeners not to pick until the 3rd year, but then I tell them, well, you can probably leave a few fruit if you're like me and you're curious and want to know what those fruit are going to be like. But I certainly would not fruit it heavily. Um, I would keep the fruit at least 8 inches apart.
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, that's the part I added. Don't worry about the blossoms. But, if you do, and again, you may get blossoms and not a lot of pollination. But yeah, if you started noticing that young tree was loaded with fruit, and good point that, if they didn't grow much last year, I would probably eliminate the fruit by picking. I mean, they sound like dwarfs, so that shouldn't take a long time. But hey, what the heck? Let a couple of them mature. Make sure you got fruit trees you like. So I guess we're in agreement.
More or less, yep.
Neither one of us are going to take off the flowers, right? We're going to leave the flowers on.
That's way too much work.
Yeah, that's like, oh my gosh, you have nothing else to do in your life if you're going to do that. Go fishing. But yeah, if it did bear a lot of fruit, and I like the 8 inches, that's a good compromise for this.
See, I have a question for you, John.
Sure.
I was out looking at an apple tree this spring that had a fair blossom. This tree's a little stressed, but the blossoms were absolutely full of thrips.
Really?
And I've never seen that before.
Neither have I.
They weren't setting fruit, but the tree was stressed, so I'm not sure it was due to the thrips.
I would be surprised. A lot of our thrip problems are secondary in that, and yeah, I've not seen them. Actually, the biggest problem I've seen so far this year on flowers, and I do get pictures of them, is the frosts that popped up, and a lot of blackened petals and that. But no, I have not seen thrips. That'd be an interesting thing, but I doubt if that would be doing much other than possibly reducing some of the fruit set. Well, I see I got another question. I was told that do not treat your ash trees until after they leaf out. And yeah, and I said as it's leafing out, and it's we're kind of saying the same thing in that once it starts to leaf out, you're going to start pulling water through it. That transpiration is beginning. There is absolutely no problem with waiting until they completely leaf out. I mean, that's absolutely fine as well. What we don't want to see is people doing injections while they're in the bud stage, or why you just have these very small, what I'll call mouse ear sort of leaves, because that's a little premature. But if the leaves are expanding, that's absolutely fine. You don't have to wait until they're completely expanded, because it will take a little bit for that chemical to work its way up the tree from injection. I would say in just about every area of the state that I've been into, haven't been to Aberdeen yet. In fact, I'm going to be up there on Thursday, so it looks like we'll be crossing paths up there, Kristine. But yeah, you do want them to leaf out. And again, now, once they've leafed out, until June is the ideal time to treat. And hey, before we leave that one, I got to give you a really sad one here. And that is, if you can see this, it's my water bottle, just has water in it. All right. we collected branches of ash trees in Sioux Falls and took them to an undisclosed location in Sioux Falls. And we put them in little containers, and we were rearing out the parasitoids to see if we could collect the insects that feed on emerald ash borer. A little piece like this, think of that, about the size of this water bottle, I could pull out, and I literally had them emerge because they're inside, so they're a little ahead of the season. You could get 4 adults out of a piece of wood this small. Now, think of that. If someone moved this small of a piece of wood from Sioux Falls to your town and you had 4 in there, you know what? You might have 2 more than what you absolutely need. And that's how these infestations start. So when people say, well, I'm only going to move a little bit of wood, something this small diameter would be the problem. And so for all you folks in Sioux Falls, you know, right now we're coming up to a key thing in terms of management, and that is from Memorial Day to Labor Day, you cannot cut and move ash wood. And the reason for that is we don't want someone moving a piece of wood like this. You know, they cut a tree in the northern part of Sioux Falls, southern part of Sioux Falls, and move the infestation. Now, I had someone call me today from a tree company up in Madison, and they said, well, do we have that restriction in Madison? And I said, no, it's a city restriction. The reason for that is Sioux Falls is a very large area. And so it made sense to help slow it. Smaller communities like Canton, for example, that already have it, the insects throughout the whole city now anyway, it's not going to do anything. But I do want to remind everyone here that if you're outside the quarantine area, Turner County, Lincoln County, Minnehaha County, where we know we have infestations, what you want to do is you can't move firewood out of the counties at any time. You can't move any ash because, again, we're not going to stop this insect, but the more we can slow it, the better. No county wants it. Oh, I see. I got a question. Oh, it said here, did you say before June they won't start? No, what I meant is you do want to get it done now in May as they're leafing out. In some areas of the state, they're still mouse ear size. And you want to get the injections done before the end of June. And the reasoning for that is the adults have to feed on leaves for a while before they lay eggs. So if you get the chemical in the spring, mom lands on the tree, feeds on some leaves, dies without laying eggs. If you inject your trees in July and August, it certainly will work. But most of the adults have already laid eggs by that point. The largest number of them are out about the 3rd week of June. And you'll kill the larvae as they're feeding, but remember, they've already done some damage already. And so the sooner in the year you treat, leaf out through the end of June, the more effective the treatment. And so I'm really trying to get everybody to do it then. And I see here, Christina says something about Buckeye blossoms. What about Buckeye blossoms?
So John, I was walking my dog a couple of nights ago, and I'm a little embarrassed to say, but it stopped me in my tracks on the sidewalk. The flowers were it was a boulevard planting. The flowers were gorgeous. I know Christina mentioned that the trees were blooming at McCrory Gardens. How long can we expect those buckeyes to blossom? And are they a floral resource for any specific pollinators or insects? I was just curious.
No, and they're not. I mean, they're nice
Okay.
flowers. And how long they last, if I could guess that, I'd be picking lottery ticket numbers. I will say the panicles that they form
Mhm.
seem to be fairly tolerant to temperature changes.
Okay.
And they're not as sensitive as, for example, service berries, where those flowers just seem to fade very quickly if it goes too hot or if we get a cold. So a lot of the buckeyes, 10 days of flowering is actually fairly common. And that's one of the things I like about them. Now, the problem with Buckeye blossoms is you get buckeyes. And unless you're a squirrel, you're usually not happy with buckeyes. And that's why I will recommend that you either plant the Homestead Buckeye, which is from South Dakota State University, or if you're from Minnesota, Autumn Splendor, which is their buckeye. And the reason I recommend both those is they tend to have a fall color, hence the name Autumn Splendor for the one. And both of them, why they have beautiful flowers, both of them are flowering on our campus right now. They flower at almost the same time, but they produce very few buckeyes. And nobody wants the buckeyes. I like some fall color, but I don't like the buckeyes. So that's what I would recommend planting those. So those would be the good ones. The only other thing, and you really can't see it, it's that tiny. And that I pulled out to yesterday. You can just see it in there. That is a pupae to emerald ash borer. Now, the ones that are outside in trees right now, they're not as far ahead as the containers that we brought inside to an undisclosed location. But they are ready, following the degree days and that, they're ready to start emerging here. I'm looking at June 1st, and I'm pretty confident with that prediction, Kristine, as opposed to how long the buckeyes will bloom. These things tend to follow degree days pretty well. So, the 1st of June, you might start seeing emerald ash borers starting to fly, but at the very least, they will be beginning to fly and infesting the tree they came out of, or going through, moving to another tree. And they don't tend to fly far. They travel far by this. Somebody taking a little piece of wood and moving it from city to city. In their own, they only tend to fly maybe a couple of 100 feet in that. Well, we spent 20 some minutes chatting here. So I think let's move off the tree stuff, but we could spend hours on that and go to Kristine, who's going to be chatting with us some other things. So take it away.
All right. So as we were sitting here, I actually realized that we have a participant on tonight's call who asked me a question this morning that I didn't answer because I saw the message and then went to work and forgot about it. So I'm going to apologize and I'm going to answer your question on air instead. So at one of our community gardens here in Brookings, a small high tunnel has been put up. And I know more of our home gardeners are starting to put up small high tunnels or use them in their community gardens. And so the question was, what can I still plant, or what should I be planting in my high tunnel right now? And Rhoda, I'm going to ask you to jump in if you have any other suggestions. But this is still a great time to put those warm season crops in those high tunnels. I would say at this point, it's too late to be doing your lettuce and your kales. Save those for the fall. Hold off on your broccoli and cauliflower. But tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, any of the cucurbits, you could do some specialty melons or cucumbers. This is a great time to get those plants in that high tunnel. Make sure you're getting them hardened off a bit before you throw them out there, and focus on watering. And remember, with our high tunnels, you need to have a good plan for watering those plants in, whether it's a drip irrigation system or hand watering if it's a high tunnel that's a manageable size, because hopefully you have it graded properly that when we do get rainfall, it's not just becoming a pond or a lake in your high tunnel. I've had those situations. I've walked into high tunnels where the mulch is floating because we had our drainage really wrong and things had to be regraded. So yes, definitely a great time to put warm season crops in the high tunnel. And Rhoda, do you have some other thoughts on that?
No, the only thing I'd add is, of course, this time of year, you really got to watch the temperature in the high tunnel and be ready to throw it open when that sun starts hitting it.
Yes, and that, just as an anecdote from my time at Iowa State, we had a high tunnel with automated roll-up sides that the electrical system failed due to some mice in the control panel. And we didn't have an alarm system. And this happened over the weekend where we didn't notice until the next day. And my temperature sensors told me it was a 60-degree day outside, but the sun came out and we had over 150 degrees inside of that high tunnel, and it baked those plants. And I recently heard a farmer from the middle of South Dakota mention that they've had more plant loss due to plants being cooked inside of high tunnels versus plant losses from freeze out. So yes, heat management is going to be really important as we head into the summer. All right. Well, on that note, I was going to talk about transplanting annual flowers, and I just want to give a shout out to our grounds crew here on campus. I started to walk by, and then I turned around and asked, can I take some pictures of what you're doing? And oh, by the way, I'm new here. Nice to meet you. And they were wondering what on earth I was up to. But the reason I took a picture of this really reminds me of planting annual flowers with my dad when I was a kid. We had a lot of garden beds. We'd bring all our plants home from the garden center, let them sit for a day or two. Sometimes I'm going to admit we got really antsy and we just planted everything that day. But I had it instilled in me, lay out your plants, have a planting plan, and also pay attention to the spacing. I'm very guilty of overcrowding plants because I want everything to look really nice and full first thing in the season. But then by the time we hit July, August, everything's really crowded. You can't keep up with watering. I've already committed this sin again with my raised beds. I'll have pictures in a few weeks to show you. So be patient and remember that these annuals are going to grow. Also, make sure that you're getting those root balls into that soil and firming up around each of those plants. We don't want to see root balls that are sticking out of the garden soil. That just creates more water loss and prevents rooting in properly. And I know we've all talked about water. We're going to continue to talk about water, but make sure you're watering these beds in when you transplant those annuals, because again, they don't have much root ball to go off of, and it's going to take them some time to get rooted into the rest of the garden soil. Here in Brookings, we took some soil samples out at our specialty crop farm yesterday. Soil samples that were taken 6 to 7 inches down, that soil was dust all the way to that 6 or 7 inch layer. So just remember, I know it's really easy to take that watering wand and just go over the soil real quickly and think, okay, the soil looks wet, it's watered. You need to stop and dig around in that soil, and you'll realize pretty quickly that you might be wet to your first knuckle, and that's it. So take your time. Soak your beds when you've planted your annuals, and you're going to want to check watering every day. And as the season progresses, we'll start the mantra of deepen infrequently. But remember, we are in drought conditions across most of the state. You're going to have to be watering your containers, your hanging baskets, and your annual beds a lot more this summer. So, all right, annual flowers. And again, it's a great time to be planting pretty much everything. We're off the adage of only planting cool season annuals. Go ahead, go to the garden center, load up, and happy planting as we head into Memorial Day weekend. For most of the state, again, paying attention if there's anything crazy weather-wise predicted for the Black Hills area, especially. Bleeding hearts are back. I feature this one. Most of our gardeners on this call might already know what a bleeding heart is, but I just bring it up because it's a favorite plant of mine from my youth. This one was here on campus. I'm a big fan of the old President's House garden. I maybe shouldn't say it on this call, but I like sneaking back there and seeing what's blooming because it's a gorgeous planting. And so that's where these bleeding hearts are. Bleeding heart is in the genus Dicentra. It is a relative of Dutchman's breeches, if any of you are woodland plant lovers, and it has these beautiful flowers. So these hearts that you see are actually the flowers. And a fun story, when I was a kid, my sister and I would pluck these blooms off and we'd pretend they were earrings, and that's what we would do. We would play with bleeding hearts. One thing to remember is bleeding hearts are going to bloom this time of year, late spring, early summer, and then they're going to start to senesce and they're going to completely die back and go dormant. And your plant is not dead. It will be back next year, barring anything, you didn't water it at all or you nuked it with an herbicide, but it will be back. So one thing you might want to plan out in your perennial garden is if you can put some annuals to kind of fill the space, or if you can tuck the bleeding heart towards the back of a planting so that You can have it show nice and showy early in the season, and then it can be taken over by like coral bells or a stilby or something else closer to the front of the planting. Some other dicentra to look for, this is kind of the old fashioned standard where you just have the pink hearts. There is a cultivar called Gold Heart that has bright gold foliage that makes the flowers more striking. There is a variety with white flowers as well that's really gorgeous. And there are also some fringe leafed bleeding hearts. So there are some great options out there. You'll typically find this in your garden centers sold in 1 gallon pots. Again, this would be a great time for planting perennials, but that's a topic for another day. So just enjoy the bleeding parts if you see them. And if you haven't introduced this in your garden before, I think it's a gorgeous plant to include for this time of year. And the last thing I'd like to share, native plants that are in bloom. So out here at our specialty crop field in Brookings, I can't take credit for the planting or the native plant initiative, but I can take credit for appreciating that the prairie smoke has bloomed and that we have the seed heads are actually what you see here that have that smoky appearance. So this is GM triflorum. It is a native prairie plant. It does well in full sun conditions, sites that have soils that are well drained and are on the drier side. It also holds up well in our South Dakota winds and looks really gorgeous as it's blowing in the winds. And so here on campus, they're growing out a variety of native plants for seed collection as part of the SDSU Native Plant Initiative. So I just want to let gardeners know on behalf of Dr. Laura Perkins that there is going to be an SDSU native plant sale on June 5th from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Central Time. And that's going to be held in partnership with East Pier Landscape and Garden Center. And for more information on the plant sale, after I stop sharing my screen, I'll share a link to the list of native plants that are going to be available at that sale. But great opportunity to get native plants. And, you know, advantages of native plants here in our state is they're adapted to our growing conditions. We know they're hardy. We know they're adapted to our soil and moisture conditions. So something to keep in mind. And it looks like I might have a question. So I'm going to see what folks are interested in tonight. All right. And Rhoda, I might ask you to help me out with this one. So how can bean leaf beetles be controlled in a community garden setting where commercial pesticides are not allowed? And I don't know if I have much experience with bean leaf beetles specifically.
I have kind of a funny story about that.
Awesome.
When we lived in Brookings, there were some pretty bad bean leaf beetles there. And they are in generations. And so generally, the early plantings will get bean leaf beetles, but then they'll disappear for later plantings. So that's one option, is to address the planting date. But I thought I was real smart. I was going to put netting over my row cover over my beans so that I would just keep them out and I wouldn't have to use pesticides. That was a great plan, except for one thing that I didn't take into account. The bean leaf beetles overwinter as adults in the soil, in the garden. And so what I did was create this wonderful habitat for them to safely eat all the bean leaves with protection from any predators from the air. So I learned, if you're going to do that, be sure you plant your beans in an area that doesn't have the bean leaf beetle in the ground already.
Excellent advice. Speaking of found treasures or nuisances in the ground, we were planting tomatoes yesterday, and one of the students pulls something up and walks up and asks Brett Owens and I, "What is this?" And we're quite certain it was corn earworm that had overwintered in the soil. So I'm going to be watching my tomatoes, because I've seen examples where corn earworm will feed on tomato plants. And Speaking of pests, we're gonna have to keep a list of questions for Amanda Bachman to talk about
Okay.
for our garden pests next week, because I got a text from my sister-in-law asking if there were aphids on her tomato plants, and it was definitely flea beetles. So another pest to be on the lookout for, and there's opportunities for trap cropping and some opportunities for home pesticide controls as well. But I told her to keep an eye on her radishes and mustard greens, because they'll probably move that direction shortly.
You know, and I got a question here too, is that what they were asking was pesticides. And I didn't know if they were just looking at synthetic pesticides, or would they be willing to accept neem oil, for example? And, you know, the neem oil is effective, but not, you have to be very targeted, because, okay, they're there and you have to apply them and they're on the other side. But there are products that have a natural origin, if you will, like neem oil, that perhaps they would allow to use. Now, the solution we had as children was you went out with a pail with some kerosene in it and you picked them. But nowadays people are on their phone too much. But hand collecting will work in a small garden. It's been done. But neem oil, I know, and there's a couple of others, and Rhoda, you may know the other chemicals better than I for a vegetable crop. But
I think spinosad might be one that
yeah,
you can.
That one works for several days. And the one that's most commonly found in the state, I love Captain Jack's Dead Bug Brew. That's the name of it. I mean, you know, and we're going to do the extension mantra: read and follow label directions. I mean, that's always a must. Make sure it's labeled for the plant and the pest, and that you be aware of any requirements. For example, don't pick within 5 days of treatment for something. But yeah, there's 2 pesticides. They are pesticides because they kill pests. That's the definition of a pesticide. But a lot of people don't look at them as, quote, chemical pesticides. And by that meaning synthetic pesticides such as carbaryl 7, malathion or such. So I would want them to know there are other options out there, but they are still pesticides.
Yeah. And that brings up, because when I was talking to my sister-in-law about flea beetles, our SDSU IPM team does recommend diatomaceous earth is one, you know, safer option for flea beetle. It's, you know, more of an exclusionary product. Diatomaceous earth, you know, we dust on our plant foliage, and it can be frustrating to use in a rainy season. But right now, the way we're sitting, it might be pretty effective. But a note on diatomaceous earth, of course, reading all labels, but being careful not to inhale that, because that would be really, really nasty on the lungs and throat.
Yeah, at least everybody has masks right now, so they've got something they can wear when they're applying. But that's a good point. And then wash it off if it's still on, of course. And you're right. This year, having it wash off would be a blessing, meaning that means we got a rain. So, you know, and I think this is all important, because there are other ways of managing pests that don't fit the usual definition that people have. So I don't want to spray a pesticide. Well, you know, you're hand smacking something as a pesticide. You just killed something. But, you know, they're usually thinking of synthetic forms. And I understand that. There's a lot of people that do want to go organic to a degree. And so there are, to me, I'm pretty impressed with the options that are available out there at garden centers, department stores and such, that really wouldn't fit that definition of a pesticide by many people. So they may want to check on that. Well, we're running along here, Rhoda, and we don't want to cut into your time. So why don't you take it away?
All right. Once we have our slides up here, we're talking a lot about transplanting today, and some of this would fit for seed starting, and some will fit for amendments for your garden, or amendments creating a soil mix for your containers or your raised beds. and people are doing a lot of different things. I've been following kind of the social media chatter on what to put in a raised bed. And so I wanted to make some comments about some of the options that we have out there. Vermiculite, you may be familiar with, particularly maybe us older people. With vermiculite has an insulation in your attic. I don't think they do that anymore, but if you go into some older attics, sometimes you'll find vermiculite up there. It is an insulating type of compound, and it's basically mica that was popped like popcorn under very high heat, and it's soft to the touch. Vermiculite we like to use because it holds water and it holds nutrients very well. It will hold up to 4 or 5 times its volume in water. So it can really help in years like this year, where we're concerned about the container drying out too quickly. On the other end of the spectrum, we have perlite, which is that white, it's a hard white little pellets. And we use those for drainage in a container or in your potting soil. You'll often see peat, and perlite has a potting soil, sometimes with vermiculite in, sometimes not. Vermiculite's used a lot for starting seed because it holds the moisture against that seed real well. So perlite can be used for drainage and aeration. It's very lightweight. So if you're looking to not have too heavy a container, you might want to use perlite. On the other hand, if your containers are outdoors and you don't have a good windbreak, sometimes some good heavy sand can be the answer for drainage instead. But so perlite we see a lot, and many times those are all combined. Peat is another one that is added many times, sometimes to your garden, maybe mixed for seed starting mix, or maybe for your house plants, and combined with these others. And peat also will hold quite a bit of water and quite a bit of nutrients. Perlite does not hold nutrients very well at all. So if you tried to grow something in perlite, you'd have to be constantly fertilizing to get those nutrients to the plant. Vermiculite and peat will hold those pretty well together. Just looking at my notes to try to remember if I was going to say something else. Okay, next slide. So another thing that we often add into our gardens is, and sometimes even raised beds or sometimes larger containers, is manure. And I wanted to say a couple of things about manure. If it's fresh, you need to compost it for at least 6 to 9 months to allow the human pathogens that may be present in manure to die out. Things like E. coli and Listeria and Salmonella, Cryptosporidium, all of which have been issues on romaine lettuce, cantaloupe, some of the other food safety problems that we've had across the US in recent years. And so never use fresh manure on your garden. I usually like to see it aged at least a year, and that will also, if you're turning it and keeping it moist, that will also help any seeds that are in it to germinate and before you put it in your garden, so you can get rid of them rather than seeding your garden with weed seed. The other issue we can have with manure is if you're not careful where it comes from. If cows or horses are put in a pasture that's been sprayed with a brush killer, a weed killer, that actually gets concentrated in the manure, and it does not break down during the composting process. It gets concentrated in the animal, and then it lives through the composting process. And the result can be this center picture. We've got some, I forget if those are squash or melons, that normally would have, large leaves, and they just got puckered up and they're tight around the edges here. That is herbicide damage. They may recuperate from this. They probably won't have the yield that they might have had. Same thing with this. In this case, the herbicide damage came in, I'm pretty sure, on the straw grass clippings here, and we can see, you see a regular leaf here, and that's what these should look like too, on the right side. And towards the bottom of the picture on the lower right, you see those small kind of stringy type of leaves. That is herbicide damage. And again, when you've got that on the new growth, you probably aren't going to have very successful production. So be aware, it can be in the compost, or it can be in manure. So be careful with where you get compost or manure from. The other thing I've seen sometimes you'll see it with peat moss for certain, but I've also seen it with compost from the Rapid City landfill. This was before their herbicide problem. A raised bed was filled with compost from the landfill. Very nice compost. And then the people that were working with kids put out the transplants, watered them very well, and came back the next day or the day after, and everything was wilted. And we got to looking, you mentioned, Kristine, about making sure that water is soaking down deep. This, after a day, had water standing on the top of the raised bed. So it was pooling, a half-inch deep, but it had not penetrated more than about an inch into the soil. So once compost or peat gets really dry, it's really hard to get that to take up water again. You might have to put in a couple drops of dish soap or something to break that tension, or make sure that you've wetted it down thoroughly and mixed it in well before you plant. So just a couple things to kind of keep an eye on. And I think that's it for those. And it seems like we've got questions on morels again, John.
I saw that, and in fact, I just tried to quickly send Kristine a slide of taking a look at the difference of the two, just so we could help those people out with that question. Again, one of the real problems we have with this is that if you're out picking, don't do it from a PowerPoint. That's not a good idea. And what I sent her a picture of, and she may not be able to put it up in time here because I'm working remotely, is the false morels. I collected a few already while I was out working in the hills today. Again, we had a little rain, so that gets them going. But they have a solid cap. It's not spongy like you do the morels. And when you cut into the stem, it's solid. Whereas the true morels, the cap is spongy material. And then, of course, it's a hollow stem to it as well. Now, that's a pretty brief explanation of the difference. And to stop any attorneys for the state from freaking out, I will say that is a brief explanation of the difference, and no one should use that as directions for harvesting wild mushrooms. Make sure you go out, as I said last time, with an experienced mushroom hunter, and you'll be able to find them. But Brookings sounds like it had a little rain. Certainly the hills here have had a little rain. Right now is actually a good time to be out. But since right now I can find both, you do want to be very careful. And Kristine may not get that slide I sent her on that, but I do have one that shows the difference between the two.
Let's see, we have a couple questions about pH and potting mix, and Kristine may want to jump in on this one too. You can actually have problems with pH and potting mix. Commercial mixes theoretically are adjusted for pH and most of the time are quite reliable. About 10 years ago or so, I heard from a greenhouse that was having trouble with, I believe it was peppers. And she talked about bottle brush roots. And we were trying for the longest time to figure out what was going on. And finally found out the pH was, I don't know, 4 or 5 at the most. Very acidic pH. And apparently they had not made the correction once they created the mix to add, usually they add a little bit of lime to bring up the pH. And the roots really were, there was one center stem and just all kinds of tiny little hair roots coming off the side of it, just like a brush.
It would have been really interesting to see. Yeah, I haven't heard recently of people having issues with potting mixes. While we're talking about potting mixes though, Rhoda, do we want to mention the one time people might want to add calcium for blossom end rot?
Thank you. Yeah, I'd mentioned a little bit about the various elements that will hold nutrients. If you're using just like a peat and perlite type of potting mix, and even if you buy one in the store that says nutrients will keep your plants thriving for 3 months, usually that tends to run out after about a month or so. And so unless it's formulated for fruiting plants, and in that case, we'll usually have calcium with it. You'll want to look for fertilizer that actually has calcium in it. Our native soils have plenty of calcium. We don't need to go out and add milk products to our soil. There's plenty of calcium there already, but when we're dealing with these artificial mixes, then we do have to keep an eye on that.
And I see we also have a question, and I'll ask everybody here to join in on this one, and that is, how long does 2,4-D last in compost? In other words, how long before it's broken down? And while the two of you are thinking about it, I'm just going to give you a story, and that is, I can remember looking at a garden that they got their grass clippings from their neighbor and from their yard. Their yard, they were using no herbicide. The neighbor's yard, they were using 2,4-D, a very common herbicide, has a lot of good uses for it. But on the side of the garden, and it was kind of interesting because they were growing tomatoes on both, and tomatoes are the canary in the cage, that if something's going to respond to herbicide, they will. And yeah, they were distorted. Now, again, by composting, they had mowed it and piled it for a bit and then put it on their yard. So we're talking, maybe a couple of weeks after an application. And this is kind of anecdotal. It was not a scientific study, but I have seen it, problems with using it in a garden. Do either you have any comments on, if you're mowing a lawn that has 2,4-D applied to it at some point? Is there a time frame we want to avoid using that?
The common advice is to wait 2 mowings after application before you collect the grass again. If you take a third of the leaf blade at any one time, hopefully by that time you're through it. I would do at least 3 mowings just to be safe, but I will also say be very careful with what's been applied to your lawn. If you've got somebody else applying treatment, they may be including some of these harsher chemicals that for the really recalcitrant weeds. And some of those, the aminopyralids, the clopyralids, are really effective at certain weeds, but they are also effective at persisting through the compost process. And that's the issue that we've had in a number of different municipal composts over the years, and most recently Rapid City. And Rapid does test theirs all the time. So if you've got a city compost that's testing their materials, you can have a little more confidence. Or if people are really wondering, is this going to be an issue for this particular compost pile? I always tell them, put some in a pot, plant some bean seeds, let them grow up. You know, within the first week or two of growth, you should be able to tell if there's going to be any damage from the herbicide.
Well, you know, we've got a few more minutes, so I'm going to open that up a little bit more. And that's a good point. And his was 3-year-old compost, so I think we're pretty safe with that. 3 years old, there's not a problem. But I'm not a big fan of grass clippings used for almost anything. And again, I'll ask the two of you. The only problem I see is people pile them on, they mat. I don't know if it's that great of a mulch. I mean, it's a common mulch. Maybe because I'm a tree guy, I prefer, shredded bark mulch, which you're not going to get. But our grass clippings, aside from the possible herbicide, is that a good material to use for mulching in your garden, let's say?
Well, I'm really curious to hear Rhoda's response, because I was writing about this a little bit today. For annuals and vegetable gardens, it doesn't make me too uncomfortable if those grass clippings are dried down and you're not just throwing 6 to 8 inches of wet grass muck that's going to just go anaerobic and smell terrible, and then you'll get that matting. So if you're doing thin layers of dried clippings on annual flower and vegetable beds, I wouldn't be doing it around perennials or dabbling into the world of trees or shrubs. I don't feel that's appropriate. But I would urge people to, know your grass clipping source. Is it your own lawn? And, I think if Brett Owens, our lawn expert, was here, he would say, trim those grass blades at 1/3 the length and put those clippings back on your lawn. That's the best place for them. So grass clippings can be used on annual and vegetable gardens, but you have to be careful about how you approach it. Rhoda, other thoughts?
That brings up a point. A lot of people think they have to collect their clippings. And, I had a mower that did that, and I did it for about a year, or maybe it was just about a month, and thought, no, I'm going to get a mulching mower. So I've never collected my leaves since. Once in a while, I have to rake them up when the yard got away from me before I got to it. But for the most part, they can add a pound or two of nitrogen back to the soil. And there's kind of a common misunderstanding that contributes to thatch. If you've got a good, healthy lawn and it's not compacted, that's going to be broken down. That will not contribute to the thatch.
Yeah.
I like that. Leave the grass where it started. I guess that's our thing. We'll tell you
Kinda
what,
like
everybody.
tree leaves too.
Yeah. Through the wonders of modern electronic, I think Kristine got my slide, right?
Yes.
All right. Pop the
did.
slide up. No, and that isn't the manure slide. All right, here we go. There's on my truck bed, and there's the false morels that I collected. You can see it's kind of a dark cap there. It's a solid cap. And if you cut into the stem, and you see I cut into one of them, it's more or less solid in there. And then if you look on the other side, it has that spongy top to it. You can see it's very open, and if you slit the stem there, it's hollow. Now, it'll be a little stringy in here, but please, everybody watching this, I understand, hey, okay, I want to see what the differences are. This is it. Do not go out and pick mushrooms based upon a picture, please. There's some other possibilities out there. And you know what? Don't stick anything in your mouth you don't know what it is. That's good advice, I think, to end here, period. But I'm quite serious on this one. Mushroom hunting, always go out with them. But if you want to see what the mushrooms, the two common ones we have out there, this slide will show you that. But I did not provide these slides as encouragement to go out and collect just based upon this. And the false morels, don't even think about eating them. All right, that's a no-no. Well, we're at 8 o'clock. And so we spent our time here, 7 o'clock for those you West River like I happen to be tonight. And I really appreciate people watching this. Certainly send us emails if you have any comments of how the show is going. We do have our 3 extension people in Aberdeen and Rapid City and in Sioux Falls that will help answer your questions. So if you said, well, I didn't put a question up tonight, but I've got a question on X, close to Aberdeen, close to Sioux Falls, close to Rapid City, feel free to contact one of these folks there. By the way, they're all great individuals. They do a wonderful job for us in collecting good information, and they can answer many of the questions themselves. But they also know enough that if they can't answer it, they know which extension specialist to contact, Rhoda, myself, Kristine, Brett, or that, to make sure you do get your question answered, because obviously in extension, that's a big role that we play in making sure that you get good, accurate, scientifically based information on how to manage any of your plants out there. So with that, I'm certainly going to thank Rhoda and Kristine for providing us a great evening here of going through. And with that, we will leave you for next week after Memorial Day, the beginning of summer. We'll see you Tuesday night. So thanks, everyone.